Good evening, everyone. How are we doing tonight? We have a lot of front row people this evening, which doesn't happen a lot, I think because we know there's going to be some fabulous art, right? We're all excited about that. Excellent. I wanted to welcome you all to the library this evening. My name is Mallory Ahrens. I'm the Associate Director of Programs and Services here at Darien Library. Welcome. Before we begin with tonight's lecture, I wanted to remind everyone that programs at the library are made possible solely through donations. Every event we do here in this space, as well as every book on our shelf, every computer in the library, is 100% funded by donations to our annual campaign. Thank you to those of you that have donated so far this year. If you haven't yet, there's still time. We got envelopes right outside if you need to. If you leave tonight's event inspired, know that you can also borrow a pass to the Museum of Modern Art right at our welcome desk if you wanted to see the exhibition for yourself live in person. I am thrilled to welcome back our very favorite art historian to Darien Library tonight. She's a specialist in modern French art and social history. Formerly an associate educator at MoMA, she continues to offer tours and courses at the museum. For the last 3 years, probably 4 years now, right? 4 years, she has worked for Boulevard Arts, an immersive technology company where she creates cultural content for virtual and mixed reality platforms. I know, cool, right? Please join me in welcoming back to the library, Larissa Baliff.
Okay, so everybody can hear me? Yes. And I heard both, I don't know if it was excitement or strangeness at the tech part of my job. Don't worry, I just do the content. I love the art and sharing, just like I do in giving lectures and tours and classes. I let other people do the software and the tech and all that stuff. Here we are, and I just wanted to see a show of hands. A few of you came up and said that you had seen the Miró exhibition. Are you brave enough to know? Okay, a bunch of you. And again, I hope that this will inspire you to go back, or for those of you who haven't seen it yet, you have until June 15th. And that is when the Museum of Modern Art is actually closing for the summer. We are expanding it again. It's been 15 years, and they're closing down the museum until mid-October. So it's a great chance right now to see the permanent collection and a few of the exhibitions that are up, including the Joan Miró Birth of the World. It is a small focus show, and I think it's a wonderful way to see MoMA's holdings in Miró's art. So I'm going to talk to you about the premise of the show, but also sort of expand upon that in terms of Miró's career. So I already said his name, Joan Miró, and one of you was asking me that. I don't speak Catalan, but it's my understanding that his name is pronounced Joan Miró, and so we will go with that. This photograph, by the way, not the easiest to see, but shows the artist up on a ladder, and it's actually taken in 1937. He's working on a mural now lost called The Reaper, with the idea of kind of thinking about the Spanish Civil War, but also very Catalan peasant culture, which has always been and continues to be really important for Miró. And I want to start with that quote there because that's going to hover around our discussion today. I make no distinction between painting and poetry. And that was said early on in Miró's career. It's said at the end of his career. He considered himself a kind of artist poet. And I think it's important for us to recognize that. And it's certainly an undercurrent of this particular show, thinking about his relationship with poets and how that liberated Miró's art. Forgive me. Okay. So there is just one shot of the beginning of the show, hoping to tantalize and tempt you. You can see with the graphics entitled Birth of the World, and a little hard to read in this, a photograph of the artist as you enter the show. I'm not going to show us many more installation shots at all. I'm hoping that you go to MoMA to see them. But I'm also just mentioning what the show is all about. There are about 60 permanent collection paintings, works on paper, illustrated books and sculptures, and 5 loans, sort of across media, that the museum borrowed to kind of to amp up some of the themes. But basically, it's a permanent collection show, but you will never, again, I think, see MoMA put out all 60 works. Is it all we have? No. In fact, we have hundreds more of Miró's work. It's an embarrassment of riches. But this particular show focuses on MoMA's collecting of works basically from the 1920s through the end of the 50s. And I'll kind of articulate a little bit more about why that period. I just wanted to give you Joan Miró's dates, and I have put there Catalan. He did not consider himself Spanish. He considered himself fiercely Catalan. He came from Catalonia. He is born, just had a birthday, April 20th, 1893. He dies of heart problems at the age of 90 on December 25th, 1983. I also put up the names of several of the places where he lives, and specifically because these are not only important to Miró, he feels very rooted to where he is. These are important centers for him, especially the second one, Montroig, which is the family farm outside of Barcelona, or that it's in the area of Montroig. He will often write on his paintings or the back of them, let you know where he is, or at least we know where he was at a certain time. And that's really important to him. It makes him feel very grounded. And because he's so fiercely nationalistic, I think we get a sense of sort of his mood and experience from where he is. So I will be talking about Barcelona, Montroig, Paris, Normandy, and Palma de Mallorca. Mostly I will be showing you works from the show, but I too amped it up by throwing in a few extras. This particular work is in the collection. I've tried to put where the collection names, if they're a private collection or somewhere else. So this grounds us in the beginning of Miró's career. So I said he was born in 1893, and he probably should have been an accountant. He disappointed his father by going to art school, but also sort of taking up accounting while he was doing that, and basically had a nervous breakdown. He wanted to be an artist and didn't want to be an accountant, and eventually his father let him pursue the arts. In Barcelona, as I said, right near Montroig, he was exposed to a lot of avant-garde currents. And it's not like the days of today of the internet where you can know, an ism in 2 seconds, right? The most modern avant-garde currents were the things from the beginning of the 20th century or even the 19th century. So he is influenced by Henri Rousseau. He's seeing the work of Vincent van Gogh, or Van Gogh, if you want to be proper. Matisse's bright Fauvist works. He's exposed to Cubism. People like Picasso and Juan Gris, who are already in Paris. But he's seeing these at a contemporary gallery, the Dalmau Gallery, where in fact he has his own first show. And he's absorbing all of these lessons of modernism and trying to figure out how he can be a modern artist. If you're wondering about the sort of artists around him, Picasso is about 12 to 13 years older than he is, and Dali is about 10 years younger than he is. So we have this kind of triad, if you will. We can talk more about that relationship. But this is the work that greets you when you go into the show. And even in the sort of dimmed light and in slide form, I hope that you're seeing the kind of bright, expressive fauve colors. He is thinking about Georges Rouault. He is thinking about Vincent van Gogh. And there's some strangeness going on as well. The distortion of the body, the dark outlines, the face being lots of different colors, that floating palette. And in fact, there's collage. That is a Japanese woodblock print, the kind of material resource that inspired so many 19th and early 20th century artists. And he stuck it right on there as a collage. So it's kind of a multimedia work. Now, this is also a kind of a stand-in for Miró in his early days, right, in his early 20s. This is a portrait of a studio mate. So he's in Barcelona, he's been going to art school, he's absorbing this contemporary art, and he paints his friend, Enrique Ricard. Sorry. And I just wanted to put it up next to a portrait of, by Van Gogh, a very famous one of basically the paint dealer, Père Tanguy, but to show you how Miró is kind of internalizing the art that comes before him, especially that yellow. That yellow is bright and acid and almost, you know, it is of the fauves, but it's also Van Gogh's favorite color, that yellow. So he's referencing what's come before, and we have that kind of pyramidal shaped figure. Yeah, that's just one inspiration, but we know that Miró turns again and again to looking at Van Gogh's art. So he knew his art history, he knew his contemporary art, and he's going to sort of transform it, if you will. This is a work that is not in MoMA's collection, but it's in the show. And I think that it's absolutely remarkable. Again, even in dimmed light, it's called The Table, Still Life with Rabbit. And again, I've put, when I can, where he's painted this. So at his family's farm, and then also in Barcelona nearby, in his studio. One of the things that's so striking about this is that it doesn't feel like a still life. If a still life is nature morte, like dead objects, these animals, and especially when you look at them in the flesh, in the oil paint, look quite alive. Their eyes are open, whether it's the rooster, the rabbit, or the fish. But also I want us to just think about, because we're going to lay the groundwork for some of this transformation in Miró's work. He's interested in all of the faceting of cubism and the ways in which you have multiple perspective. He's tilted up the table. People said that Miró was smoking from the pipe of Cézanne and Picasso at this point. You know, he's pushing the boundaries of painting here in interesting ways. And one of the things that struck me most that was said by the curator of the show, Anna Umland, is that, especially with a work like this, but throughout Miró's career, we should always think about his work as landscapes. Now, this is a genre of a still life. It's stuff on a table. That's its own separate genre. But look at the way in which he's tilted it up. There's a kind of topographic view. So he's breaking the rules and you know, bending the genres already. And I'm sorry, the title got a little away from me there. Let me see if I can push it up. I just wanted to show you a self-portrait of the artist as a young man. He doesn't do a lot of self-portraits, so when we get to another self-portrait in the show, and this isn't in the show, I think you'll be quite surprised. And within his oeuvre, it's very unusual. But here he is, sort of assessing his position in Barcelona and trying to figure out his strategy to become a modern artist. And I love the ways in which, having come just from that painting that we just saw, the ways in which his shirt is faceted and geometricized, and Miró is already sort of playing with space. This work is in the show, and it's a wonderful sort of pivot piece because, again, we see Miró thinking about how to overtake the art world, how to position himself. And again, it's a still life, sorry, I should say with glove and newspaper. And we have the dates in which he made it. He has his eye on Paris and wants to live there. So he travels to Paris and spends time there. He will frequently stay in Paris for months at a time, and during the summer, and you know, sometimes these dates vary a bit, but the summer into the early or even late fall, he'll go back to his family home. I mean, he's a starving artist, but he'll manage to get on the train and do that. But he says at this point, I can't stay in this backwater. As much as we're bringing contemporary art into Barcelona, I have to go to Paris. I need to make a name for myself. I want to be an international Catalan. I can't stay back here. So that's his goal, his agenda, his ambition. And we think about all of these different artists coming to Paris at this time from Eastern Europe and Italy and all over. Chagall says, I had to come to Paris. I was planted like a seed, and that's how I could blossom and grow. And Miró feels that way too. So he is feeling sort of proud of himself and a great sense of adventure, and he goes to Paris and paints this work. It's got the Gallic cock there. It's got, which is a bit crockery from back home. It's sort of synecdoches for a male person. He's got the glove there that's almost like a hand, the cane there. And he's also got the newspaper. And the newspaper there, this is all painted, it's not collage, but tilted up for us to see, you know, a la Picasso. But the masthead of the newspaper is there, and it's a sort of man's face, and then it says Le Jeu, or Le Jeu. We don't even get the U there, right? It should say Le Journal. And Picasso and Braque had played with this and, you know, clipped and pasted and things like that. But what he gives us, Le Jeu, we know it's a newspaper, but it also is a fun fragment that stands for lejos, or far away. He's far away from Catalonia, he'll return, but he's also beginning to make his mark. It also, I should say, is text, is language. And as we begin to think about how important language and sort of a calligraphy and a kind of writing is for Miró, it's fun to see it grounded in that newspaper masthead. Here is another still life that he does. Again, he's spending months at a time in Paris. In fact, as I said, he goes to Paris for the first time in 1920. Picasso, as a fellow Spaniard and ersatz Catalan artist. Picasso's actually Andalusian, but you know, when he's in Paris, he feels like, okay, I'm gonna show you around a little bit. He buys one of Miró's paintings, introduces him to people, praises some of Miró's work and says, there is a poetry to this. And Miró says, yes, I want to give a poetry to humble objects. And we can see already that he's starting to create sort of discrete spaces and toy with this relationship, figure-ground relationship with these objects, all sort of separated. There's a tomato and a carbide lamp and some other you know, humble peasant tool, farm tool. But I have to say that you know, when Miró arrives in Paris, he says, it was like a jolt to my system. It was everything that he needed. Especially knowing he can go back for the summers. He ends up renting a studio, this is not it, on the Rue Blomet. And Miró starts to surround himself with, part circumstance and part because he wants to, not with artists, but with poets. Artaud and Sarah and Michel Leiris, and he learns things from them. And he says this early period in, you know, the 20s, this is what showed him the direction his art would go in, and as he moves into surrealism. But as he's sort of figuring things out here, and again, we can see that he creates this wonderful work in 3 different places over several months. He even takes a handful of grass from his farm in Montroig and takes it back to Paris so he can feel that this painting is so real. Now, this is not in the show, but this is the one work I would put in the show if I were the curator. And it's a work that you may have seen before. If you haven't, you can go to the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. It is, as I said, called The Farm. It is based on Miró's family farm. And as he says, he's really interested, or I should say, he's writing to friends and telling them what he's doing and creating works like this, that he wanted to show things as small as the snail and the boards of the roof. He wanted to get everything down into this picture. And it's a really incredibly special picture. And some of you might know that it is purchased by a person who becomes a friend of Miró's, Ernest Hemingway. So Ernest Hemingway is making a name for himself in Paris. He's living with Hadley, and he has no money at all, right? But he is in interesting circles, and and he knows good art when he sees it. And he falls in love with the farm, and he actually pays 5,000 francs for it. And him and Miró will actually become boxing partners. They'll do sport together, but not over this, not for this picture. But he pays in installments, and Hemingway gives it to Hadley, although it ends up in Hemingway's hands when they divorce. But I'll just read it, because I think this is really, really wonderful, and I think it speaks to not just the painting, but in a certain way, the way Miró was an international Catalan for his entire life. No one could look at it, that is the farm, and not know it had been painted by a great painter. Nobody else is recognizing Miró at this point. It has in it all that you feel about Spain when you were there, and all that you feel when you are away and cannot go there. No one else has been able to paint these two opposing things. So we have this sort of dualism of Paris and fierce sort of Catalan culture and the land. We will also kind of feel that, I think, that tension and that equipoise between painting and poetry in Miró's work. And that's just a detail. Again, we can see, maybe not in the slide, but little details on the building and the newspaper and the watering cans, and Miró has laid them out for us. Something changes, and that is Miró continues to be involved with avant-garde poets, and Surrealism is forming, right? Whether we say it comes out of sort of Dada prankishness and absurdity. By 1924, André Breton is going to pen his manifesto and say who's in and who's out, but he's going to say grab your Sigmund Freud and do your automatic writing and draw from your unconscious. And Miró gets on board. He'll never call himself a surrealist, but he will show with them. So he's showing in galleries in Paris. He creates this work, and in fact, André Breton buys it in 1925, right after he pens the manifesto. And he felt that Miró encapsulated a great deal about surrealism. He said he's the most surrealist of us all, okay? But what he's getting at is this shift, the way in which Miró has taken what was realism of a certain kind, or detailism, to an extreme, and moved into this different kind of language, a language of signs, a language of diagrams. What he's showing us here, and this is called the Hunter Catalan landscape, and he's digging into perhaps more Catalan colors, or the colors of the earth in some ways, but the landscape is flattened out. It's more like a field of a background. What he says is he's showing us a hunter, in fact, the artist himself, or a hunter or peasant, getting ready to barbecue his lunch. And we have the fish there, the sardine, and in fact he gives us a little bit of fragment there in this wonderful script. There is also, over there, a rabbit. Now, if you're having trouble seeing it, I have trouble identifying it, because in fact Miró has to sort of identify all of this for us. There's a carob tree. This is the gun. This is the hunter. There are flags. There's a lot going on in this picture that most of us would have trouble, or even a dealer or Breton, recognizing. And of course, there's a wonderful sort of eye in the center, a telltale sign of surrealism. But it marks this shift in Miró's work, where he's going to be using a kind of personal symbolism. He doesn't care if we get it or not. Or sometimes it's inside jokes. Sometimes there's layers and levels, right? This is the beating heart of the hunter. Wow, that's deep. This is the excrement of an insect. So again, juxtapositions and depth and profundity and fierce Catalan sensibility. There's a lot going on there. But the ways in which they're kind of spread out and the scale has shifted means that Miró is approaching his work very differently. And the idea is that that really comes from him following what these surrealist poets are doing. Here's another work, it's at the Met, but I just wanted to like put a little buffer between the hunter and the birth of the world, which gives name to the show, and in some ways is this pivotal moment of change. With that said, and before I talk about this, one of the things we can note about Miró's career is not only that it's long, but that he is constantly experimenting. You see that throughout MoMA's show. It's something the curator wanted us to be aware of. Or if you've ever looked at his work, he will work in groupings and do something in one media, and then he'll turn and do something completely different. So there are motifs that run throughout and a kind of visual language, or poetry, if you will, but also constant sort of engagement and experimentation. So here, he's written in French, "Ceci est la couleur à mes rêves." That's beautiful, and it is a kind of poetry. And photo, it's mystical, it's mysterious, and he uses that paint. So as he said, I make no distinction between painting and poetry. It's all going to come together. Whether I'm writing or I'm painting, it's the same thing. And of course, a very sort of sparse blank background, if you will, foregrounding. Space is really important to him, and he talks about it in making compositions. Here, very much so. So we get to the birth of the world. And again, this was done or finished in Montroig during the late summer and fall, but with very much with Paris, you know, in Miró's mind. This is a very beloved work at MoMA, but I want to start out by saying it hasn't always been in our collection. Historically, well, I should say it belonged in the collection of a Belgian collector, René Gaffé, who purchased it and appreciated it, but when it was painted in 1925, even though Miró had Breton's support, nobody liked this work. His friends, even the poets, said, "This is a hoax. I think you've gone too far here. What are you doing with Birth of the World?" So this collector swooped it up and kept it in Belgium. And then eventually, you know, Miró felt that it was still very important and had a long connection and relationship with MoMA from the 30s on. We had our first retrospective of Miró's work in 41, another in 59. And Miró actually sold some paintings of his to make sure that we could acquire The Birth of the World in the early 1970s. So it was important to him. And I think, you know, history makes this an important work. But here we have our Birth of the World, a very large work. I just want to show scale. I mean, we can see the dimensions, you know, it's 8 by 6 plus feet. Here we have it in the galleries, not in the show, but in the galleries per se. So we can see it's, again, it's ambition, it's scale, it's monumentality. Yep. Are you saying is the slide a little bit off, or? Mm-hmm. The slide is a little bit off. It is dark and moody and accidental. So I'm glad that you asked that. I was going to jump into that. It's a perfect segue. And people weren't sure how to sort of appreciate or understand that. So Miró felt that he was really interested in automatic drawing and the kind of access of the unconscious, but he only wanted to take it so far. But what he did was very experimental. He used a sort of wash of paint, and he rubbed it, and he sort of poured it. This is pre-Pollock. And he was very interested in this kind of chance operation. This comes out of Dada, this idea of you're not quite sure how much is going to sink in or what it's going to look like. And so he sort of lets himself have free rein in the background. And we get sort of associations and ideas from it. It's sort of primal. It shifts and changes. Even in slide form, we can see kind of how it fluctuates in the light and is darker in some areas and lighter in others. Now he takes that kind of accidental, you know, very large scale, changeable, if you will, background, and then he draws on top of it, essentially paints on top of it with these more sort of solid-like forms. Now, he said years later, when Bill Rubin, one of our curators, asked, where did those come from? And he said, oh, they just sort of came out of the ooze, the chance operation. I just started painting them. Well, we know, and it's not that Miró was disingenuous, it's just he might have forgotten, because later sketchbooks were found and were made public, and it turns out that very clearly he had done sketches for this, thinking about how it might go. So again, I'm not saying he's lying. I'm saying he probably forgot and kept looking back, thinking in the moment of that time of the birth of surrealism and automatic drawing, that this sort of came out of that primordial storm-like chaos. Regardless, it's an amazing and interesting and troubling work, which gives us, I think, insight into later works and his interest. This is where we really start to see, with the Catalan landscape, and then moving into that personal symbolism of stars, of suns, of, he actually calls this a bird, this kite-like form there, the idea of the storm. He says this is, at one point he says this is a person on a bicycle. This would be a star form. The red, we see often these circles, and he calls it the sun, and we'll point it out and say that's what it is. But you might not be buying that. Some of you might think it's the red balloon. That wonderful French movie comes after. And it is, in a certain way, it can be a red balloon. Also a spermatozoa, right? So let's be real. Miró is playful. He can also be dark. He has inside jokes with his friends. He is taking from them not just automatic writing, but the way in which you can put forms and writing all over your page, right? And that becomes a part of the composition. And you can also speak to funny things or base things. He does a lot sort of drawing on the idea of Catalan culture and the notion of the simple life of peasants, and celebrates that. But also it comes back to men working the land, men and women. When we talk about the birth of the world, there's an eroticism to it, or at least a sort of functionality, if you will. It is the birth of surrealism at this moment, but it is also the kind of notion of begetting children, or the beginning of things, origins, the very beginning, origins today. Yeah. So it's a good question, sort of, in relation to Picasso, who said it's up to the viewer or whatever, although I think Picasso was often very explicit about certain things, or he's like, this is my girlfriend, or like, take it or leave it, kind of things. Miró tells his dealer certain things, and often will identify things, but part of it is shrouded in mystery. And we know because he'll explain things later on, but then sometimes we have to think about, is that 50 years on? Is that 20 years on? So he does talk about this later in his life, but I think we can gauge it a bit based on some of his other works, and the fact that there's sort of scatology and sex in some of his works, and it's undeniable. And he talks about, not to put it on this painting, but he not only talks about poetry, he says, I want to make things that are like notes, shapes that are like notes, or like letters, or like poems. He describes painting like admiring a beautiful woman or a poem. I mean, he thinks about beauty. I mean, I guess Picasso did too in his own way, but I think Miró felt that it was all sort of linked together. That the joy of painting, the freedom of painting, was like appreciating life in all of its senses. And we'll circle back to his amorousness, but in terms of interpretation, he does leave us some track record of what he thought about things. When it's something like he tells Bill Rubin, and then we realize it wasn't quite the way history played out, we have to be a little careful. Just flashing through, you'll see other things in the show. This, of course, is like, taking that sort of sparse background and that sort of way in which, in the birth of the world, we have a background that's disconnected from these personal symbols, almost like a collage. he will also play in much more sort of crowded compositions. In the late 20s, he visits Amsterdam and Holland, and is very interested in taking, he has postcards, taking the old masters and one-upping them, making them funny, distorting them, stretching them in very, very playful ways. I mean, look at how this here, this maybe mural or window to the outside world mimics that, but he's completely distorted. He's having fun with this, and again, this is how he sort of works in series and groups, things that inspire him. But I hope that we can understand that some of that kind of personal symbolism weaves its way through that kind of poetry. In 1929, he gets married, October 12th, and he marries a woman named Pilar Juncosa. Now, Miró's grandparents lived in Palma de Mallorca, so he would visit there from time to time, but his wife's family came from Palma de Mallorca. So in the second half of his life, he will settle there. That is their baby, Dolores. You get to see her a little bit more grown up. By this point, it is 1939, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, what's going on in his life. So here, just to move into those other directions, I have two works that are on flocked paper. And you'll see his paper is a bit colored, and it's also rather toothy, if you will. He liked the way that pastel would catch on it. He liked attaching things to it. And here we have a sort of wonderful, I think, juxtaposition that the curator sets up for us, Anne Umland, in the show, that you can kind of look at different works representing the same motif. And the Spanish dancer was a theme that he took up several times and would work on groupings. This group he made 4 of, and this one is kind of a reprise. But throughout his career, he would use collage in different ways, whether it's sort of kitschy or pretty postcards. There is sandpaper in both of these. He is drawn in one, so using his sort of flights of fancy. This Spanish dancer, he actually gives us more of the body, if you will, if I can say that. And you can see some of the things that are it's made of. And again, he made 4 of these. One was purchased by Breton. We really need our Freud for these, or maybe we don't. I mean, it's self-explanatory. So he doesn't need to tell us exactly what these Spanish dancers are. One he attaches a little doll shoe to, and this one doesn't have a doll shoe, but it has a triangle, a drafting triangle. And in fact, the drafting triangle has a cork in it and a little sticker there, I think, that says, "Enter for free." So I don't think we can say that Miró is not sort of playing inside jokes, you know, taking up the theme of a Spanish dancer that we can't quite put our, I mean, it's not realistic, but it is an experimental way to represent a figure. And it's also kind of, you know, kind of in motion, and it's interesting. Now, I don't feel too bad for that Spanish dancer because most of the figures in Miró's world, you know, are treated that sort of phantasmagorically, if you will. That wasn't a particular Spanish dancer who was like, "You represented me how?" It's just part of his experimentation. So he will also create objects. This one is a little bit dark in slide form, but there's a red sun, as he says. It is pieces of wood with nails stuck in them. He's going to push away from painting for a while. And again, this is part of his experimentation, part of his moving through different phases and interests. The white, which is so pronounced in this slide here, and the red, which is receded, he says is a woman's body. To me, it looks very much like a guitar. And one of the things that he said, and to bring up Picasso, is Miró kind of wants to overthrow the father figure, if you will. And so he says, I want to break Picasso's guitar. I want to, you know, his cubism, that's too bourgeois now. I'm going to do something different. So that's one of the kind of motivating factors in making strange works using these materials this way. One of his good friends is Jean Arp, so I put one there, but it's a little hard to see. And I'm going to bring Picasso in just a little teeny bit more as well. And again, looking at these, we might not think that this is the same artist, but we're tracking his different interests, but also kind of the history of what's going on. This is Miró's Bather. It's a small work, little teeny work, and she looms large there. We might be able to make out her body. That's kind of her profile, her head bending down. There's that red sun, again, sort of personal symbolism that keeps coming back. But Picasso has nothing on Miró, in my mind. I mean, Picasso is great and radical. That's Olga, by the way. This is not Pilar, it's just a bather. But, the Surrealists are gonna, or those associated with them, are gonna take on the female form, and they're gonna shift it and make it mysterious or predatory. And, here is Miró weaving in those bright colors and that sun-like form. Another work, and in the same room, right? Would we think that this is Miró? I think 1936 is really the year of the Surrealist object. All the Surrealists in Paris, whatever their nationality, are going to the flea markets and finding something, compelled by a spoon or a gas mask or whatever, and they're putting it together. So I'm gonna throw it out to you. He just calls it object. What do you think? What's he talking about here? I mean, I think this one's kind of funny, right? We have a bowler hat. It may be a little hard to see. We have a bowler hat that he's mounted this wood piece on. There's a little plastic goldfish. He has a map, this bird with this dangling ball, kind of a la Giacometti. Do I need to prove my case that he had sex on the brain? And he doesn't in every single work, but it can be there. But this sort of stockinged leg that kind of moves. It's a kinetic sculpture. And I think, with this, he's putting these things together. He's hollowed out that wood, and he's saying, what's on a typical man's mind? A man who goes to the office. We have to remember bowler hats were worn by everybody, men. You go to the office, you sit at your desk, and what do you think about? You think about travel. That's a rather phallic perch, by the way. You think about exotic birds, and you think about romance, right? Miró is making books as well, and so this personal symbolism, visual, poetic vocabulary goes across his books. There's a wonderful vitrine in the show that I hope you'll spend time with. He worked on 250 illustrated books, artist books, and he did also 1,500 lithographs and etchings outside of this. So he worked with other writers and poets. He wrote his own poetry, and to be able to see kind of his own handwriting and his engagement with this, I think really reminds us of how important poetry was to him in different senses. And it also, I think, continues to reinforce this idea that when he's making paintings with these fields, these flat fields, that it is almost like collage, or there isn't always a relationship between the background and whatever is shown, whatever is on there, a dot or writing. And I think that helps us understand his works a bit better. This one is not coming out very well in the dark. What I've put up is a sketch that he made. He was cutting out clippings from an equipment manual, and that becomes the basis for a gigantic painting in which everything is transformed. So we don't always even know what's behind these shapes. I would never, ever think that his shapes were inspired by sewing machines and propellers and things like that. But he uses collage not only to create works of art or works on paper, but as a sort of jumping off point for his imagination. This is probably my favorite work that Miró ever did. And I think it connects well with these issues that we've been talking about, with its kind of mutable blue field in the background there, and then these forms and figures. And a little hard to see, and this is 6 by 8 feet, those words there. And again, his handwriting, or the handwriting he chooses to paint with, I think is very interesting. Swooping and scripting. I don't know if you're familiar with Ed Ruscha, the contemporary artist's work, but he does a lot with font and making words like, liquid looks like that. Well, Miró was doing that first in really interesting ways. So this work in particular, and I think is more joyous than most of the works at this time because we're really leaning into the time leading up to the Spanish Civil War. This was created as a cartoon for a tapestry. So there was a woman in Paris who was trying to invigorate the tapestry industry. In the Middle Ages, Paris and the Netherlands, this is where these great tapestries were made. And so she hired modern artists to create cartoons or paintings. And you can tell that Miró had no sort of thought about how hard that would be to work on a loom. They were eventually made, and eventually he learned how to work the tapestries himself, how to create them. But this one is about, I think, the sort of joyousness of space, of painting. And if we're wondering what the words are, most of us know amor is love, hirondelle is swallow, like a bird. And there's a swooping and sort of wonderful tumbling. The birds sort of pull us up, the words sort of swoop around. And then at the bottom, we have acrobats sort of tumbling. And what, I don't do gymnastics, but if I did, we know that or if you do, or if we think about it, we watch gymnastics, there's a liberation in that, where you are freed, from gravity as if you could fly. And so I think, he's embedding all of that in there in a wonderful way. But as I say, Hirondelle Amor, gives way to works which show the stress. So there are a number of works in the show, whether they're pastel on paper. This is an opera singer. She's shrieking. I mean, and it's not that he's anti-woman. He is representing the difficulties and the tensions of this pre-Spanish Civil War period, the sort of bestiality of humanity, the difficulties, but it's also extremely sexualized. This is a different type of work, not on flocked paper and using that pastel, but a three-dimensional work. And again, he's very early on doing these assemblages and things that project. This is pre-Rauschenberg. So this is part of a series, he calls it Rope People, or Rope and People 1. And he paints around a sort of coiled rope, and he says, these are people and they are oppressed. Sorry to get into dark issues, but he's trying to sort of work through this and think about what's happening. This is a stunning work above the vitrines where the books are. This was a poster that he created to raise money for the Spanish Republic during the war. So it is a peasant, fierce Catalan peasant raising its arm. And again, in the beautiful, like very modern colors, the primary colors, but colors that he, Léger, Mondrian are using at this point. The 1 FR is 1 franc, and l'Espagne. I'm gonna contextualize that and say he shows a mural at the Spanish Pavilion in '37 at the same time that Picasso shows Guernica. And so, we are at this moment of Franco's oppression. And in fact, Picasso sent Guernica around the world with the proceeds going to raise money for back in Spain. And some of you might know that we had Guernica at the Museum of Modern Art. It was supposed to go back when Franco was no longer, but we kept it a little bit. And finally sent it in the 80s to the Reina Sofia. But huge monumental work, and it gets more of the attention for the works at the Spanish Pavilion. But Miró had created a mural. Their friend Julio González created a sculpture of a peasant woman screaming. And Calder, Alexander Calder, actually created a work. I'm going to speed us up, and as you can see, with a lengthy career and a full career, Miró, and so prolific. Miró has already, created groupings and monumental works. Some people say that this still life with old shoe created in Paris is a kind of, and it's not as big as Guernica, but is a kind of Guernica. It's an address to the Spanish Civil War. So Miró goes back to Paris thinking he's going to show some works, and he gets stuck there. He's been going back and forth, and now he's in Paris. And he stays in Paris from 36 to 41, essentially, or 40, into 41. And by saying stuck there, it's too dangerous to go back with Franco. But of course, then it's too dangerous to be in France, right? People are fleeing, they're going to New York. He's got Pilar and Dolores there, and eventually he will go to Normandy, back to Paris, and they'll essentially get out on the last train and go back to Barcelona, Montroig, and then basically Palma de Mallorca. But just to say, I think we recognize that this is a really very different work of art. It's very incandescent. He says he needs to be grounded in reality, and he writes to his dealer. So his dealer at this time is Pierre Matisse, Henri Matisse's son, who is dealing out of New York. He's Calder's dealer as well. And he talks about the need to kind of deal with the realities and the fact that he can't go back, and he's worried about family. So he sets up a gin bottle, a baked apple. Look at that fork plunged in there. I mean, there's a bit of Dali in this, but even more extreme. And talk about landscape out of still life. You know, there's brown bread and there's an old shoe. And the old shoe, he says, is a reference to Van Gogh and the notion of all the kind of soul, pun intended. No, sorry. But, you know, the sort of, the philosophicalness of a shoe and what it embodies and the sort of difficulty in this ever-changing world, this world aflame. He does come here. So he comes here in the 40s, and in fact, for an extended period of time. Let me just see if we can tie it into a work of art or not. But it's a great question. And this is a self-portrait that he does, and it's not faded. When you see it, it is completely unlike anything else. And then he redoes it years later, which you won't see in the show, so I thought I would bring that up. But a very sort of apocalyptic, based on Romanesque murals and sort of, he's looking in a convex mirror in Paris. But let's get him out of there. Let's get him back to Spain. And this is a great segue, actually. I'm going to show you two works that are started. He does a whole series of 23 works called the Constellations. And this one is called Escape Ladder, and it's done when he's in Normandy. And he dates them on the back, and he wants us to know exactly where he was and what date. Sometimes down to the day. And he can't escape. You know, he feels he's being watched. He doesn't know if he can go back. Things will subside enough, and he will go back, as I said, to Spain. And it's still dangerous, but it's less dangerous under Franco. But he's oppressed, and even painting, you know, he could be taken away. He could be killed at any point. And so to paint and to continue and to grow your reputation, which Franco doesn't want for him, is a defiant act. He comes to New York, as I started to say, in the 1940s. He works at the Hayter, not works, but creates prints at the famous Hayter workshop in the Village, where Jackson Pollock and Louise Bourgeois and others congregated, which I think is really exciting. So he was here for an extended stay. I mean, he was oppressed, but there were times when he could get things out and have exhibitions outside of Spain and also visit. He came back a couple of times in the 1950s as well. And during that period, he was exposed to the work of the Pollock, again, in the sort of New York school. But it's thought that with works like this, and actually this one, that Pollock and others, seeing these works that were first shown in the United States in 1945, that the New York school kind of embraced all over abstraction. And you know, while this is a small work, Pollock and others were engaged by this. The sort of fields of color, or lack thereof, the all over abstraction, et cetera. And I just want to point out, again, there were 23 constellations that he made across this sort of treacherous journey. His only escape, in a certain way, sort of tension-filled. but which come to really sort of solidify his reputation in the United States in 45. And I started to say something, I'm sorry. Oh, I wanted to read the title, "The Beautiful Bird Revealing the Unknown to a Pair of Lovers." If that's not poetic, I don't know what is. So this idea of text and language and title for this particular set, the Constellations, important for him. By the way, he didn't name them the Constellations. These works that again embrace, and in this case, in a very sort of thorough, full way, these signs and symbols, the birds, the tracery, the calligraphy, the kind of hieroglyphics, if you will. And some of this is sexualized as well. I mean, in the sense that these ideas, these symbols appear in other works, right? There is a pair of lovers. I'm not saying they're doing anything, but I am saying some of his symbolism sort of flows freely in this work. Just to sort of wrap it with a few slides, there is also a section in the show of works that he does in ceramics. Again, experimentation coming to the fore. He becomes very interested in the 1950s, actually starting in the 1940s, working with a man named Artigas. He loves collaborating, whether it's with writers, other artists, and also learning. I'm going to learn more about ceramics. I'm going to make things. I'm going to do things in tiles. I'm going to do things in tapestries, and constantly sort of learning, growing, shifting. This is a work from the show. It's made in the area of Galicia, and what I can't show you, but you can enjoy in the show, is it almost looks like an abalone shell when you see it from the other side, and the sort of iridescence, and it's playful and it's childlike, and we've seen those eyes, and we've seen these, you know, large distorted faces, and he's just moving that to another medium and exploring that. And there's even a little hard to see here, a little tracery sort of inside the face. And even despite all of this difficulty and all of the challenges and the fears, he continues to produce and to bring whimsy and interest to his work. This is a very large work that he created for Harvard, and it's in the show. Again, playing with tracery, a little harder to see in the slides, but the bold, bright colors, ostensibly he says there is a bowl in the center. We keep going back to birds and bowls and suns and moons and a kind of language. There is Walter Gropius from the Bauhaus fame in front of the work when it was at Harvard. So he asked Miró to create this for a dining room. Fortunately for MoMA, it began to deteriorate. In 1952, when it was put in there, they thought it would last, but they realized a dining hall is not such a great place. So they replaced it with tiles, and MoMA was able to bring it into our collection. That's the scale and how you can see it inside. This is not in the show, but just, again, to kind of round out, one of the sort of thrusts of the show is that, you know, it ends in the 1950s or 1959 because that was the time when we had our second big retrospective of Miró. And at that point, his reputation was solidified. He was getting commissions for Harvard. He was, even under the oppressive thumb of Franco, gaining world recognition. This is one of the two UNESCO walls that he created for the new building in Paris at that time. And again, we see symbolism that we may be able to understand, or we at least recognize, but suns and moons. This is the wall of the moon. There's also some more optimistic even wall of the sun, the bright colors, the kind of forms that we've seen throughout. And I wish this was in the show, but it's in MoMA's collection, and I thought it would be wonderful to sort of bring this in. to continue his career. This is from the 1960s, although he starts the first versions of these in the 1940s in very small scale. There are several versions of this, so if you travel, there's one, at the Mate Foundation and other places, but this is our moonbird, and we're just seeing it basically from, one side there. But I think even with that, you can get a sense of kind of the protuberances, the voluptuousness, the way in which there's a duality. It is kind of male, kind of female. It is kind of bull, kind of bird, as the title says. It's bull-like with the horns there, but those also become the sort of crescent. It is very ancient and ancient-seeming, I should say, very kind of fertility form, and large and monumental, buoyant, and again, there's a heft to it, a profundity, but it's also eroticized and meant to sort of make us, be provoked by the hybridity of it, and its kind of in-your-faceness of all of these different forms. And I just wanted to say, of course, that Miró will continue to paint, but he will also, as I said, work in many different medium, and unfortunately this is a tapestry that was in New York, but was lost. A taksha to use. There, the fin. So like a tapestry, I hope I've woven together some very disparate strands of Miró's career and a little bit of his life, his sort of peripatetic life. I love the question about his coming to New York, and I think that, again, tying it back to MoMA, he had such strong relationships with James Thrall Sobey and Sweeney and other early curators and scholars, and that got MoMA into collecting his work and writing about it early on. It's also why the sort of thrust of our collection is from the 20s through the end of the 50s. Other places, of course, where you can see Miró's work, and there, it's in most collections, but the Centre Pompidou, the Fundación in Barcelona has a lot of his later works. Palma de Mallorca, where you can go visit his studio, has a lot of the sort of late works, and also just giving you a sense of where he spent the second half of his career. So that I highly recommend. And there are a few other centers of his work. There was one wife, one child, and yes, he was very devoted to, as much as he enjoyed the eroticism of his pictures, I think he was somewhat singular, as I understand, and kind of a sort of devotion to her, and to his family life and to the grandkids, and yes, so Pilar was his mate for life. Not to the fame that he achieved. There are people that, the grandsons who helped him in the studio, and also one of his relatives, I think it was a grandson, helped sort of choose some music selections to go along with his work. So you can go to the MoMA website and hear some things that relate to kind of his experience of that, a sort of distant relative. Yeah, flocked paper. So it is a sort of thick, dense paper, and as I use the word toothy, so it catches the pastel, but it gives a certain texture. And he liked to use it whether he was using pastel or not, but he liked it because it had a sort of denseness, not because it was like thick and could hold things, but because it almost looks like felt. It feels, it has a richness to it, not rich as in like fine art, but something that he thought was another layer of, mixing it with the sandpaper, mixing it with foil, mixing it with, a string was more interesting for him. So he tends to use it. There are a few works that he does collages where it's more like a simple white paper or now cream-colored paper because they have changed color a little bit. But he used a lot of flocked paper. And once you see in the show, it's thick and colored and it's part of the experience for him. Almost like, now that I'm thinking about that, it's not mutable like the backgrounds, but to him, the background is really important. It's an important component because you're not showing perspective, which he hated. You know, he's overthrowing tradition. He's like, no orthogonals, no perspective. I don't want you to know the relationship of the figure to what's behind it. It's almost like everything is a collage, but he still thinks the background should be interesting. So flocked paper has some interest. Yeah, it's a good question. There's lots of letters. There's lots of letters and lots of sketchbooks, and most of them are in the Fundación in Barcelona. Yeah, but I would say it's more like in letters and back and forth. Yeah. Yeah, a mix. He does things like talks a lot about the mystery or the, but going back to letters and such, he does talk to friends, and he talks a lot to his dealer about what he likes and what he doesn't like and what he's thinking and what he's not. So especially he had Pierre Loeb in Paris first, and Pierre Matisse both in Paris and New York, where he discusses what he's doing. And also, I mean, there's a whole period, and we did a focus show on this between 27 and 37, where he talks a lot about wanting to assassinate painting. He's ambivalent about it, and he makes a lot of statements about what he's trying to do. So we do have a sort of a strong sense of a lot of what he was thinking and talking about with his friends. Some of it comes from later and is kind of read back in, like because for instance, and I don't want to make it all about MoMA, but Bill Rubin, who was really invested in Picasso's work and Miró's work, sat down and interviewed them. And so there is writing after the fact, but it's 1972, 1973, 10 years before he passes, and some of it, he may be thinking about it too much in hindsight, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So personal life, he, as I said, he always collaborated. He had a studio mate. He liked Ricard. He was very friendly with the poets and felt indebted to them and writes them, and talk. I mean, we have recorded things, during the 20s and all of that. He was very depressed at certain points, particularly during the time when he was in Paris and couldn't do anything, And interestingly, unlike Picasso, I should say, he did go back to Spain, Catalonia, Palma de Mallorca. But there were times when he was depressive. On the other hand, the pictures we see are often very joyous. He was constantly engaged with art, whether he's doing set designs and puppet shows at the end. There was a certain, I don't want to call it a joie de vivre, but there was a certain fire with him that never went out until the very end. So I think it was a sort of combination of things. It seems like he was a nice guy. I say that because that's so rare. I just have to but he had very good friendships. Like Sandy Calder, Alexander Calder, was a dear friend throughout. So he was able to maintain those. Unlike, forgive me, but Picasso, who was terrible to his friends, not just the women, we can put that aside, but to his friends, and felt too much rivalry. Miró seems to have been a good guy. Meaning that interpretation changes your perspective on them. Yes, well, I mean, again, and I brought that up because they're deeply entwined, their friendship and their artistic language, so that notion of I'm going to do this part first, their notion of the cosmos, of the red and the white, and the kind of tracery, which moves from Calder's mobiles to some of Miró's painting. There was a shared language that came out of their deep friendship, and I think their interest in a kind of abstraction. With that said, I'm going to say Miró says, I'm not an abstract artist. He says, they invite me into their house of, abstraction, he says. He's playing on abstraction, création, a group of artists. And it's like, but I'm not doing that ever. I'm never completely abstract, so I want to say that. In terms of how we read them and perceive them, I think part of that, and whether it's when we drop in the interpretation or not, I never want you to lose sight of how you looked at it first or continue to. I just say that because I think they are many things, and I'm crushing together decades of his life. I'm interpreting them based on, and scholars' work using his words, looking at whole groupings of paintings and also what he says about different groupings and time periods and why he might be doing something at one time. But it doesn't mean, or I don't want to kill some of the mystery, which I hope is still in many of these works. It's to say that this is an artist who constantly experimented, constantly sort of reincorporated, interpreted things, but also makes it clear to us that stars are this black sort of spiral thing, but that's also the female anatomy. If we don't know that, that's okay, because he's making it sort of 2 layers. It doesn't mean we don't get something great out of Miró, or we don't have to like him either. Is it?
Spectral almost.
Yeah. So I just, kind of flashed that on the screen and then flashed the one later, which is kind of funny that he kind of graffitis it or reinvests it in a, Miró way, much like that other playful portrait in the show that his friend gave him. But this idea that Miró doesn't necessarily let us into his world. I showed, a first self-portrait. He only does like 4 self-portraits in his entire life. He's not a person like Picasso or some others. Like Matisse, he doesn't do a lot of self-portraits. So, I think that the portrait that he does, the self-portrait, we talk about in the museum as a kind of one-off, even more than the shoe picture, the old shoe, because it is so unlike anything. It is him, but it's also so different from so faded looking, so cosmic, his eyes ablaze. It's spectral is a beautiful way to describe it. We know that he was looking in a convex mirror and painting this, and that he felt that it may be the end of the world. I mean, it was a devastating time for him. But it is interesting that he also invests, he's looking there, he's putting himself onto the canvas, and that it is such a one-off. That, I think it was important for him to kind of exercise, maybe deal with himself. I mean, I don't want to be too pop psych, but like, kind of, where am I at this moment? I'm trying to think of which still life that is. It's the rabbit one. Okay, so that's a private collection work. I don't know if it's an original frame. The curator didn't sort of stress that with us. My guess is that it's not, that it's changed hands. But what I will say is, meaning like when it was sold in the very, very beginning. What I will say is I absolutely know that Miró wanted the most plain, simple frames for his work. He wanted the most simple. And he didn't want it to take away from the work. He didn't feel it was going to add to the work. So for him, the most minimal. And that's not necessarily how people frame them, but as you noticed, they're pretty sparse. A lot of things change hand. Even in MoMA's collection, we tend to put frames on things, but Miró wanted the bare minimum. He felt very, very strongly about it. And he would tell you, too, if, he would comment upon that. Is anybody else? I know we have to. Okay. Thank you so much for letting me come back.